Atlantis, the Lost Continent, presented by Radio Canada International. This program is the first in a series of 4 on Atlantis, created, researched, and produced by Robert Zend. In this program, 4 roads to Atlantis. Why just 4 roads? Of course, you may find this title strange and think that there must be more than 4, at least as many as the number of investigators. Each seeker clears his own path, as it were. It would be safe to say that during the centuries, more has been written about Atlantis than about any other problem. A bibliography compiled by 2 French scholars, J. Gattefossé and C.C. Roux, as far back as 1920, listed more than 1,700 books and papers, both scientific treatises and works of fiction. Since then, in the past 57 years, this number may have easily doubled. It may very well be that all these seekers cleared their own paths, yet all paths lead into 4 main roads, and these are the mythological, the historical, the scientific, and the mystical. Let me introduce you then to 4 seekers traveling the main roads to Atlantis. We selected them quite carefully. There are no adventurers or occasional enthusiasts or shallow bestseller seekers. All 4 of them have sacrificed long decades, if not their whole lives, to the research of the lost continent and its never-ceasing magic. First, the comparative mythologist. You will hear an 80-year-old scientist, the doyen of today's Atlantologists, and a member of the Royal Society of England. His name is Egerton Sykes, and he's interviewed by Canadian poet and broadcaster Robert Zend in Brighton, England.
Mr. Sykes, what made you the greatest living expert on Atlantis today?
Well, what originally happened was that I was a small child living in Belgium, and a friend brought me round a copy of a book by Jules Verne called 80,000 Leagues Under the Sea. In it I came across the famous portion where Captain Nemo, descending from the submarine Nautilus at the bottom of the sea, turns to his friend and says, "Those are the ruins of the long-lost Atlantis." That fired my imagination, even as a small child, and from then onwards I started on a diet of what you might call romantic semi-science fiction, because science fiction had not been invented in those days, in order to give myself ideas on it. When the First War started, I was in the army. I landed in France at the beginning of October 1914, and I stayed there for several years. And I was lent a copy of a book by Ignatius Donnelly called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. That fired my imagination again to such an extent that from the end of the First World War until now, I have been not only a fervent enthusiast for Atlantis, but I have made a point of contacting everybody about who was in the slightest degree interested in it, no matter what their nationality or whether their opinions agreed with mine. It made no difference at all. My magazine Atlantis, in which I have published everybody's ideas, including my own, is now in its 28th year. And when I came back to England, I had already made plans for the starting of the Atlantis Research Center, which still functions after all those years.
Our second seeker, representing the historical approach, is Princess de Ruspoli in Tangier, Morocco.
My name is Martha de Chambra Ruspoli. You want me to say that I'm Princess Ruspoli? I won't say that, because I don't believe in titles. I believe that nobility exists in the head and in the heart, and there is no other. And I've worked on a book called The Divine Hawk, and now I'm working on a second book, which is called Christians Before Christ, and which is indirectly a sequel of the other. And Gavin Maxwell corrected my English translation of my book. And Gavin Maxwell said to me, I think you're right. I'm completely convinced by your theory, but it's going to take a lot of time before people realize that it's the right theory. You see, when you come to people and you tell them that Eden and the world started in the West and not in the East, as they have absolutely decided that everything came from the East, well, they've spent so much money writing and published so many books and have got so many libraries that when you come and tell them not at all, it did not begin in the East, it began in the West, they don't like it. I've read the whole book. Don't have any doubts in your mind. You have found the truth.
What is this truth?
The truth of the book is that the world was probably the civilization, primitive civilization of the world, and the great civilization was formed in Atlantis. And this idea of the creation of man and all that, and of a wonderful type of man, was probably in the Atlantis, and everything was destroyed by the crash of Atlantis, and there were only very few survivors.
I would like to ask you how you got involved into the research of Atlantis. What gave you the first impetus? Because everybody has his own personal story regarding Atlantis.
Well, I had just had a very great sorrow, the death of my daughter, and I needed to have my mind occupied by things that would take me quite out of the contingencies. My daughter died in 1953, and I began then to study. And I've studied ever since. And all the time I find new things, new texts, and of course my last years of work at the Vatican Library have been extremely profitable, and I have thousands of pages of notes.
Now, the third road, the scientific, represented by Dr. Manson Valentine, who just a few years ago discovered the famous underwater Bimini ruins at the northwestern edge of the sunken continent. Toronto filmmaker Noel Moore was invited to Miami Beach, and while in the midst of preparation for the filming of the underwater and aerial expedition, he recorded his conversation with Dr. Valentine.
I wanted to find evidence for Atlantis through zoological channels, through my work in zoology, zoogeography, and whatnot.
You are, that is your...
I'm a paleontologist and a zoologist. Mm-hmm. When I was exploring caves of the Appalachian system, I discovered a whole fauna of cave beetles, blind cave beetles, incapable of existing outside limestone caves. Mm-hmm. And I was very pleased to note that many of the genera, the new genera that I found, had counterparts in Europe, which, of course, suggests either continental drift or an Atlantis. The continental drift is a little bit hard to visualize, since the amount of time necessary for separating the continents to the extent that they are now apart would not account for the beetle similarities, since these beetles are relatively recent in geologic time, like all modern insects. Mm-hmm. Beetles are not anything that existed in the Paleozoic age. So, there must be some other